And welcome to this week's edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff De Forrest. Very happy to have you guys with us here on the Bleacher Brothers Network. And this is always a pleasure for me, as it's kind of a source of pride for me that at one point in time I had a career parallel with this gentleman, as we both started out at small newspapers in Southern California.
That's right.
Our guest today started out in Escondido. I think the paper was coming out like 2 times a week. He used to pick it up for free right next to the papers that were featuring strip clubs in those many boxes they had on the corners in San Diego. And I was in Fontana, California, east of Los Angeles at the Fontana Herald News. But unfortunately for me, that's where the parallel ends, because we're introducing a gentleman who was on not only 60 Minutes, HBO Real Sports, CBS, ABC, NBC, has written all kinds of books, bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, has some of the hottest stuff on the market, produced videos, the Tiger Woods thing, fantastic. And I ended up replacing Catherine Kuhlman, who, because she was deceased, I ended up replacing her at KREL in Corona, California. And that was kind of my career highlight. We welcome to the show one of the greats, Armin Katayan, joins us here on the program. Armin, how are you? Thanks so much for doing this. It's always a pleasure.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's election day when we're doing this.
Oh,
I don't know if you're involved in any kind of election coverage with your various affiliations.
I voted earlier this week. I live in Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut. It's I was actually talking to one of the officers here, police officers this morning. It's we're pretty mild here. I mean, we're not Pennsylvania, and we're not certainly Georgia or Nevada or it's a pretty blue state, so it's pretty calm. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what the results tonight. Though I don't think the election will be decided tonight. I think it's going to be a couple more days before everything gets settled out.
Have you ever seen anything quite like this, though? I mean, with all your work in investigative reporting, what aspect would you most like to be investigating with regard to what's going on in the election?
I've covered, back in 1976, I worked for Frank Church, the senator from Idaho. I was part of his advance team. I really didn't know much about advance until I went to Washington as an intern, as a volunteer, actually on his presidential campaign. And he ended up winning a couple of primaries, and he was in the talk to be a presidential vice president under Carter. But I've been following politics for a long time. I've never seen a country more divided. The partisanship and the vitriol right now, things that are coming out of certain politicians' mouths, would never have been uttered before in the past. So, I've got two grandchildren and daughters and married, and I just more worry about the direction of the country right now than. I'm 71 years old. I'm on the backside of these things, but my grandkids and my kids aren't. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next 48 to 72 hours here.
If you were writing a book of fiction, though, could you come up with a character like Trump?
Not really.
If you ran this by your publishers that you've had success with in the past, maybe you took it to the same place where you had the Billy Walters book recently, a smash success. Would they laugh you out of the office or think that you'd lost your mind?
I don't know. I think he's I've been reading a lot of, I read H.R. McMaster's book, and he spent 13 months as the head of national security advisor for Trump. I'm reading War now by Bob Woodward. And the one thing I've really come to understand is when you're dealing with Putin, and you're dealing with China, and you're dealing with North Korea, and you're dealing with Saudi Arabia, and you're dealing with the African nations, the conversations that are being had are so direct sometimes, and that they're at a level where, you're looking at sometimes at nuclear war in certain situations, and you want somebody that A, is engaged, and B, is level-headed. And I have to say, in the war book, Biden comes off so strong and so powerful and so connected. And then you read McMaster's book, and here he is advising Trump on various things. And, it's almost like you're walking a child down the aisle in some ways. Trump has great strengths in some areas. He had great instincts in some areas. But, when you really get inside that Oval Office and you're dealing with the kind of life or death situations, whether it's in Israel or whether it's, in Ukraine, I'm just looking for something that's a little more stable right now. I'm tired of what we've been through as a country for the last decade. It's just exhausting, and I'm sure it's exhausting for a lot of other people. But I would just like some sanity, both in Congress and some serenity, just in our lives, and not just political lives, but just everyday lives.
It would be a pleasant change, that's for sure. And I think a lot of people are with you on that, Armin. All right, let's go back. After your stint in San Diego, you ended up with the San Diego Times Union, I believe, also, which is a
Yeah,
very prominent paper on the West Coast. It was one of those places that when I was at the Fontana Herald News, I sent a few applications, none of which came back with anything favorable. But you moved on from there and then latch on with one of the iconic organizations. Unfortunately, not doing as well. I guess they're still in existence in some form, but you end up with Sports Illustrated in
yeah.
the 80s and pretty much were there throughout the decade of the 80s. Tell us about how you got
Well,
involved there.
I started out actually, just to put it in perspective. I started at a place called the Life News, which was that's that weekly newspaper, Devo, that you were talking about. They threw on people's doorsteps on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a shopper. Then I went to the Times Advocate in Escondido, and that was a daily newspaper owned by the Chicago Tribune, and that's where I kind of learned whether I really wanted to be a journalist or not, because you were writing every day. You're covering high school teams. I was covering the Padres, and but I was also very focused on, okay, what do I really want to do? Where do I want to be? And when I was writing for the Union Tribune, I was sending stories back to Sports Illustrated at the time, and I had won some awards in San Diego for my writing for the San Diego Union and for San Diego Magazine. And lo and behold, in 1982, in February of '82, or it would have been March of '82, I got an offer as a researcher reporter at the magazine. And I think I may be the only person in the history of the magazine that's turned the job down.
Oh, really? Wow.
My wife, still my wife of soon to be 45 years, Dee Dee, was pregnant with our first daughter, Kristen, 8 months pregnant. And she was like, the last place I'm moving is from San Diego, where we owned a home and had two cars and two dogs and a good life. I'm not moving to New York City in the dead of winter. And this was 1982 in New York. It was not a pleasant place. It was like Escape from New York kind of times. And so I turned the job down. And then in April, they called back. There had been another opening in the reporting staff, and they said, we're going to offer you this job one more time, and we're not going to offer it a third time. So I said yes. I came back to New York by myself in June. Ivan Maisel, who you may remember, is a great
Yeah.
college football writer. Jill Lieber. There was a really talented group of people that came in. And yeah, I kind of lived on my friends' couches and, slept in my office when Dee Dee finally came to New York. I said, I'm going to give myself 2 years. I'm going to compete against the best of the best and see if I can crack through. I was 29 years old, making $27,000 a year. So when people say, oh, when I was at CBS and chief investigative correspondent, kids would come in and go, oh, I'd love your job. And I'd be like, yeah, good luck trying to get that. But I had great passion, and I still have great passion. And as things turned out, I established a reputation as an investigative reporter for the magazine and wrote some stories that got in the magazine. I was there for 7 years, and I just went about a month ago, and you mentioned it. The Sports Illustrated had its 70th reunion of the first printing, the first issue of the magazine back in '54. And everybody was like 150 of us from the history of the magazine. Everybody from Jack McCallum to Tim Layden to John Wertheim. It was a kind of a who's who night, and it was inspiring in some ways, and it was sad in some ways, because I was there in the heyday of the magazine, and the magazine, as you well know, has gone through several iterations since then. And I think it's on its way back, but we all thought for a while it was just dead, and it was deeply disappointing to those of us who cared so much about what the magazine meant. So but that started it, and then I got into the TV side. I was fortunate enough to be hired by Roone Arledge at ABC News for World News Tonight. And that kind of started I think I spent 26 years in network television. So I'm proud of that work. And, I'm proud of the career I've had.
Sports Illustrated. I remember as a kid, we couldn't wait for this. That we would attack the
Yep.
mailman as they were coming to the corner and say, "Hey, just give me my copy of the
Yeah,
magazine. We
Thursday
couldn't wait to get our
afternoon.
hands on it." Yeah,
It was Thursday. Yeah.
yeah. Some great people were there. I would imagine you were also associated with Frank De Forrest, and I remember
Oh, yeah.
I loved Bill Knack. He was writing about horse racing.
Bill
It was
Mack,
phenomenal.
Doug Looney, Ed Swift, Curry. Riley was there. Rick Riley had just gotten there. Mark Mulvoy, who was the managing editor, was very, very good to me. Sandy Padway, who a lot of people don't know, but he was our North Star. He taught at Columbia, the Graduate School of Journalism, investigative journalism, and I could probably name 25 rock star journalists that came out of Sandy's classes. And I just saw him. He was a difference maker in my career. He would send me out with, whether it would be with Jack or Doug or sometimes with Curry, and we would do these stories that in those days, the way the magazine worked, you were competing against the local newspapers in big cities, whether it was New Orleans or Houston or Dallas or wherever we ended up. But the magazine closed on Sunday night. And so our reporting had to be done pretty much by Saturday afternoon. And then Doug would write or Jack would write. But that reporting had to hold until Wednesday. So you had to be 2 or 3 days ahead of people on point shaving scandals or steroid stories, or they were hard news, breaking news stories. And, those newspapers, and like whether it was the Times-Picayune, I remember doing the Tulane point shaving scandal, there were some accomplished journalists on that, or whether it was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and you're dealing with really heavy duty investigative reporters. And in order to make the magazine's work stand out, we had to be 2 or 3 days ahead in that reporting. And that's not for the faint of heart. I mean, I said one time to Doug Looney, I said, Doug, I know you don't eat, because every time we get up I want to have something to eat. You're like, we got to go. I said, do you sleep? And I mean, I'm just trying to get a couple hours of sleep.
That's crazy. Yeah, I remember I used to have to put the Ontario Daily Report, which was an afternoon newspaper, to bed. And it would come out in the mornings on the weekends. So we'd put out the Friday night paper, and I was responsible for the final editing and everything, and the sports section, which was the last thing to go. And I would try to put it to bed early because the guys in the press room, it was sort of a primitive method back then, what we're screaming, "Hey, come on already, De Forrest. When are you going to keep us here all night?" And so whenever I got what I thought was the last story, I would put the thing to bed, and we'd all go to the restaurant across the street, and they get smashed. And a guy that I work with would say to me, "What if the Dodger plane crashes between now and midnight?" I'm saying we're fucked. We're going to lose the job. So that was hard to maintain, especially if you're.
It was nerve wracking, to say the least. And I remember one time there was a guy, we were doing a Memphis State point shaving questions about the Dana Kirk team, and we actually interviewed somebody at 6:30 in the morning. We knocked on his door. We knew he wasn't going to come to the door. He was a pawnbroker in Memphis at the time, and he had an intercom system. It's the first and only time in my career I've ever interviewed anybody through an intercom. At 6:30 in the morning. I'm like, Doug. He goes, "Nope, it's the 6:30 rule. Once after 6:30, you can interview anybody." And then it was Doug and I, asking this guy questions. After he said, "What the hell are you guys doing here?" We're like, "Well, you kind of stiffed us a couple times at the pawn shop, so we need a comment." So we did that something.
Yeah. Now, some of the investigations you did, it's interesting because you mentioned steroids, you mentioned point shaving, gambling stories, and cheating in college sports, I guess, lack of ethics in college sports. And as you go through those, and I was looking at some of the things that you did at Sports Illustrated, I'm thinking, wait a minute, all this stuff is still applicable today. So what's changed in your opinion, Armin, about the situations?
I mean, John Talty and I just did this book, and I'm sure you're going to mention it, but it's The Price. It's a deep dive into the chaotic state of big time college football. It's kind of the system 2.0. When Jeff Benedict and I did this book about the deep dive into the state of college football back in 13, um, I think we are in a brave new world in college sports right now. But if you go back in time, as we do in The Price, you realize that what we're witnessing right now could have been stopped, could have been mitigated, could have been negotiated decades ago. And I look at the history of the NCAA and the presidents and the thought leaders in the association, and when you look at the abuse of the student athlete, as the NCAA got richer and richer and richer, you can go back to the days of Walter Byers. And I actually, with Doug Looney, interviewed Byers, and I think it was in Mission, Kansas at the time. And I mean, he ran the NCAA for 36 years like a third world despot. And he did. And I go and look at the legal challenges that were put forth, going back to EA Sports and things like that, to share. And as millions became billions, all the NCAA did was delay and deny, delay and deny, delay and deny in court and in print and in speeches. And what we have right now is the result of that. This chaos, in this wild, wild west that these coaches and universities are dealing with right now, is nobody's fault but the associations and in the big picture. And things really haven't changed. Well, what was under the table certainly now is above the table. The good old days where you could buy a player, just paying off the athlete himself or the parents or the uncle or whoever it was, that's kind of quaint compared to what we're dealing with now. And certainly, $1 million NIL deals or more for really, for the real prominent players. I just feel like you reap what you sow. That old proverb, where what we're witnessing now could have been recalibrated. It could have been negotiated, as I said. But, there are going to be point shaving. I did a bunch of point shaving scandals. I did the Arizona State. I did Tulane. There was questions at Memphis State, as I remember before, as I mentioned. We're on the brink of, because of legalized sports betting and the billions of dollars that are being spent now on people's phones, we're just one turn away from another huge scandal. I think that's Charlie Baker. I know the current president of the NCAA, that's his number one concern right now, not NIL, not the portal. It's a huge gambling scandal, and they're doing everything they can to educate, but I think it's almost fait accompli at this point in time that someone else is going to be reporting it here in not too distant future.
Seems impossible to totally legislate this sort of thing out of the game, because especially now, I mean, it used to be you'd go to your bookmaker and you'd say, hey, give me Temple -3 or whatever.
Yeah.
And that was it. You pick a side, maybe you go with a total. And now you have all of these player props where,
Exactly.
and I mentioned Temple, I think they're involved in a scandal right now that kind of is, disappeared a little bit from the public eye, where players were, going, taking themselves out of games. At the very beginning of the ball game, they get in, they come right out, and maybe their over under on points was 4, and so they're naturally not going to score. And there were mysterious bets being made all around the world.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. You look, I mean, I did the Billy Walters book. You mentioned it. He's the greatest sports gambler in the history of sports gambling. A book that came out a couple of years, last August, year ago. So I've been kind of living in this world. I lived in that world for 3 years as sports gambling and sports betting was legalized one state after another. In 2023, $100 billion was bet legally, $100 billion in this country. Last month alone, I saw the numbers in New York State for September, $2 billion was bet legally in New York State alone in 1 month. So that's more than Nevada was 745 million was bet legally in Nevada. there was $1 billion bet in New Jersey. So just in those two states alone, 3 billion. It's incredible. And I think you mentioned these parlays and these teasers. Those are by far and away, and I can't tell you how many times Billy told me this, they're the worst bets that somebody can make. The odds are the worst. The payoff's terrible, but you're getting blasted on your phone with these these ads all the time saying, okay, we know you're down, but for another X, Y, and Z, you can do this. And the one thing I learned from Billy, who won 36 straight years in a row, is he spent $2.5 million a year on his brain trust with algorithms and probability theories. He understood the NFL games going back to 1974. And that's the only way that you're going to win. And even then, you're going to be in the rarefied air of about 2%. So unless you understand, and I'll get off the soapbox in a second, but I think speaking to your audience, you have to figure out how much you want to lose and how much that entertainment value is for you, because you're going to lose. Ultimately, over time, the odds are against you, 11 to 10, the props, the parlays. You have to figure out how much you want to lose. And then, as Billy has said, and this is a really big point he made, he never bet more than 3% of whatever his bankroll was on a single game. So if you're $1,000 is your limit for the year, you're betting what, $30 on a game. And when you start chasing your money, it's a dead end. And I'm sorry, I know I've said this.
No, this is great. I mean, you're talking to a guy. I want to have my ashes spread at the 16th hole at Gulfstream, where all my horses died. But yeah, you're definitely. We often theorize that the reason you see gamblers dying with their mouth wide open, they always, when they check out, you see them in bed, and it's like. It is because the last thing they see, the number flashes of the amount of money you lost lifetime. And that's a number I really don't want to have to recognize or acknowledge.
No, but it's great entertainment. I understand it, because now, more than ever, you're just bombarded with these ads. But I think in FanDuel and DraftKings, with all due respect, are not doing their clients, and this is where Billy will get on a soapbox, because these guys that are the sharps, they understand if you win 3 or 4 games in a row, you're either going to get bounced from the book, or they're going to cut your limits back so far that you just can't sustain a winning streak. So what Billy's one of his suggestions is spread your bets around. Don't just stay with one book. Don't just be a FanDuel acolyte. If you have a DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, someplace else, at least then you can find the best odds, because those odds are different. And I just know from a lot of one of my son-in-law's friends, they are, I won't say addicted, but I'll say they're very interested, this time of year. Yeah.
Well, there's, a wild buffet, an assortment of stuff with college basketball coming on the scene last night. They give you 50 games that you can go ahead and take a shot with, and I'm sure there were people that parlayed all of them and tried to hit.
There was a bet, Devo. I know with the first game of I think it was the last game or one of the World Series games, the over-under on how the first pitch, whether it was 94 or over or under on 94, you could bet anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's where I just feel like, it's just take it for what it is. I mean, it's entertainment. If you think you're going to make a living at it, think again.
Yeah, no, it's insane. When Brent Musburger started his thing, Las Vegas Sports Information Network, they used to put a little blurb in the New York Post, which I get every day, and I called it Brent's Bury America campaign, because the more sophisticated they got about the analysis, it seemed like the further off they were. Interesting. Now, you're hanging out with Billy Walters, world's greatest gambler, and that's a distinction that it isn't just some bogus claim. You could talk to Stu Feiner; he'll tell you he's the world's greatest gambler, while he's trying to hawk you $100,000 parlays that you just mentioned, or a kiss of death. But this guy was the real deal. What was he like? How did you get that project going, and what did you take away from it, Armin?
Well, he's one of one. I say he's an American original. I've never met anybody like Billy. I probably will never meet anyone like Billy in the rest of my lifetime. We were brought together his crisis communications guy that deals with all of Billy's issues, including at the time, the Southern District of New York, where Billy had been convicted on insider trading charges, which are part and parcel of the book. And I think it was a great injustice as to what the Southern District did, the lengths and the depths that they went to. And it's not just me saying it, was Preet Bharara, the head of the Southern District in New York, admitted in a ex parte letter that I have that there was an incontrovertible fact that the head of the FBI office in New York was leaking secret grand jury testimony repeatedly to the Wall Street Journal reporters and New York Times reporters. But Billy as a person is, he grew up dirt poor in Kentucky, Mumfordville. He was known as the Kid when he was 6 years old, 7 years old. He was a pool hustler at 9 or 10, became the most successful used car salesman in the history of the state of Kentucky. In 1965, he made $57,000 in commission at a time when that's like $500,000.
Fortune, yeah.
And 2024 money. He's been married, was married twice, was married at 17, had a child. He's overcome more obstacles. He was with the computer group, moved to Vegas, of all the places when you're an addict, an alcoholic by Billy's own admission, and an addicted gambler. Where do you go? Well, you go to a place where, dreams die for, lunch and dinner. So that's, but he worked with the computer group, moves all their money. They changed the whole scope of things in terms of using algorithms and other kinds of computer generated information to just crush the books for 5 years. And then Billy becomes not only one of the most successful sports gamblers, the most successful sports gambler in history, but at one point in time, he owns 11 golf courses and part and parcel of 21 car dealerships. He's extraordinarily successful. But what I love about Bill is that he has given more money to charity and philanthropic causes, including most recently after spending 31 months in a federal prison in Pensacola, Florida, went in at 71 years old. He comes out, and what does he do? He gets involved with this group called Hope for Prisoners because he had mentored these other convicts at Pensacola, realizes that there's really little or no hope for them once they get out. So what does he do? He partners with Hope for Prisoners and the state of Nevada to set up a facility where these guys can learn how to be air conditioners, electricians, technical jobs, and to give them an opportunity to have a second life outside the prison walls. And I know how bitter Bill was about what happened to him. And I would say 99% of other people in this world would have gone back to his $20 million house in Rancho Santa Fe, played golf, and said, screw you, I'm going to just live my life. No, what he does is he does what very few men would do or women would do. He goes and helps other people. And he's done this time and time again. That's why this book was so successful, Devo. It wasn't just that Billy's the greatest sports gambler or he has this incredible personal story. It's just so rich in the sense that somebody who could be so bitter in the end is doing everything he can to help people that are less fortunate. And I think it's one of the reasons that Bill and I connected, because I feel I'm that way too. And it wasn't easy. He's one of the most difficult people that I've ever dealt with because he's a perfectionist. There were a few times when we were going over the book and I'd be at his house out in California and he's literally reading every single word and every single sentence. And he goes to me, let me tell you the backstory about this person. And I'm like, Billy, we have no more space in this book for backstories. And I literally took my head and I went like this. Finally goes, okay, all right, but God, to get to but it was I was really lucky. I was very fortunate to get to know the man. We still consider each other friends. And I know there are other projects out there. There's a doc in the works and there's a movie in the works on his life. And I think well deserved because people, even a greater audience than the book debuted at number 2 on the Times list, nonfiction. So it's done very well. But I think there's even a greater audience for the Billy Walters story.
All right, one last thing on Walters, because it sounds it's fascinating. Obviously, I saw a lot of the interviews. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm going to put it on my must-do list here for those trips to the beach, because obviously a character that many people
I'll
that
send
are
you one. Just
yeah,
text me your address.
I will do that. Yeah, if I can cop it for free, even better. Then I can bet
Absolutely.
that money on a parlay, a 16-team parlay on FanDuel tomorrow night. But you mentioned, he got into the algorithms and all of this stuff, and I've never been. I'm fascinated by trend handicappers that come up with that. Well, you know what? This is the 17th time in 21 games when there was a full moon, and
Yeah.
the economy was at this level. And they go through all that stuff, and I'm thinking, well, what the hell does that have to do with the team that's playing right now? Nothing. I mean, you look at the Patriots, for example, they might have dominated for 20 years situations against teams, especially in their division, but then they lost Tom Brady, and they weren't the same team anymore. So I think these trends lost their validation. But did he go by gut instinct? I mean, you would have to think at
No,
some point you would just say, hey, you know what? I think Cleveland is going to do it tonight.
no,
Never.
it was all for Billy. It was math. It was like, here's the line. They have on -3. He would break down. He probably had 50 different categories that he would look. He and his team, his brain trust that he spent $2.5 million on. One guy graduated #1 at Caltech. That's how smart these people were. The other one, another person I know who I spoke to, both of these gentlemen, ran the economics department at a major West Coast university. So they understood numbers and they understood the value of certain things. So everything from travel, teams that had traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast to play on a Thursday night game, how did they perform that game? And then how did they perform the following week? Snow conditions, weather conditions, injuries, #1 in Billy's mind were, and they would take, like if Joey Bosa comes out of a game with an injury or isn't going to play or is only at 75%, there was a number that Billy associated with Joey Bosa. And all of those numbers, the congregation of those numbers, probably, I don't even know, dozens of different variables, they would come up to a number that then Billy would compare against what the posted line was. And when he found separation, a 2-point differential, which was significant on an NFL game because the games are so good, the lines are so good now, he would bet X amount of dollars for every half a point. So sometimes it would be $250,000 per half a point. So he could be in for $1 million on a game where the swing was 2 points, just for your audience. And then in this documentary that has been shot, and I've watched it, and it's fantastic. He talks about the Kansas City game and San Francisco game, the Super Bowl, where Billy, for the first and the only time I've known him in recent history, where he actually gave his number for that game, and he picked Kansas City. He had Kansas City favored by 3, and he had the game at 41. A lot of people had San Francisco. The sharp money was thinking, oh, Billy's just, this is a fake. He's going to say because he likes San Francisco. No, he loved Kansas City because of Mahomes, because of the kicker, and because of their defensive coordinator. And what happens? Kansas City wins by 3, and the game hits 41. So, I mean,
That's
I'm
amazing.
telling you something. That's, I don't know. I don't know what you call that, but that ain't stupid. I can tell you that.
No, it's amazing. I guess he was well ahead of his time because you're starting to see some of these oddball stats surface in people's handicap and equations. And being a baseball fan since birth, I'm watching this game 70 years. I'll read something in a handicapping column and say, well, "What the hell is that?" I never heard of that stat, but
Yeah.
sounds like he was sort of onto this kind of
He would bet
extrapolation.
everything. I mean, here's the other thing. He had, and you'll see this in the book when I send it to you, but it wasn't just Billy Walters betting. He had 1,600 accounts around the world. So he was able to mitigate because everybody was looking for Billy's number. Oh, that's Billy Walters is on that number. Boom, the line would change immediately if they knew that that was Billy's number. So Billy had to figure out a way to disguise and camouflage where his bets were coming from. So not only did he use beards, people that would go in and bet on his behalf with hundreds of thousands of dollars, a one woman went in, she had a purse. She would go into the Stardust or she would go into the Mirage. She would have $300,000 in the purse. Who does this?
It's crazy. Yeah. Like you'll see somebody show up with a knapsack on Super Bowl Sunday at Caesar's Palace, and it's like a kid looks like he just slept in his car, and then he unloads like $250 on the counter. All right, well, we have to get into some of the other things that you've done because obviously fascinating. I thought of you recently. I was at a meeting, believe it or not, at a bare knuckles fighting championship event at the Hard Rock, and who shows up in the company of Michael Lohan, Lindsay's father, who has his own bout with infamy, but Rachel Yucatel.
Yeah.
And Rachel Yucatel, and all I could ever think of when I was being introduced to her was when she sat down in what I think was the link promo between episode 1 and 2 of your Tiger Woods documentary. On that was that HBO that aired that HBO, and it was fabulous. Well, really well done. Obviously, an extrapolation of the book. But and I couldn't forget about where she kind of sat down. I think she might have even lit up a cigarette, and she gives this look like she's at a truck stop somewhere and says, "So what's this going to be about?"
Yes. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah. That was great. Tell us about that project, the book, and
it was
Tiger.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Jeff Benedict and I, we wanted Rachel for our book, and we tried and tried and tried. We left notes and letters, and she had in Westchester County up near here. She had a children's clothing store that she owned at the time, and we would go in there occasionally and just leave notes for her. She never spoke to us for the book, but she read the book, and she was really impressed and grateful with how we treated her in the book, because I actually believe that, with all due respect to Elin, that at that time in Tiger's life, Rachel was the love of his life. She certainly had been through a lot of drama and trauma in her life, and she and Tiger would get together and he would say, "I just need to plug in with you." And he would literally lay in bed with her, where she said, "I couldn't move. He would just be so close to me." And she goes, "I'd end up just watching Discovery ID over and over on television while he slept, because he didn't sleep. He was an insomniac." And so when the doc was being done, Alex Gibney, who was the producer of it, the head of it, Rachel agreed to meet Alex and Jeff and I in New York, to just kind of get a feel of whether she would be interested in sitting for the doc. And when she walked in, it was a very nice restaurant in New York. She makes a dramatic entrance.
I mean, whatever doctor she's using, she's done a fabulous job.
To me, I can see where she could be an incredibly appealing woman to a lot of guys. She's very smart.
Yeah.
She's a little damaged, in certain ways, which is appealing to certain people. But she was so sweet. And I just know, because I wasn't there the day it was shot, but Matt Hamachek, who's the director, who was there the day, called me. He goes, "Wow, it's some kind of day." It took like a couple hours for Rachel in makeup before she finally came out and felt comfortable in her skin there. And then she sat down and she kind of sashayed into that chair and then she was just so dialed up, and you're just like, whoa, Rachel Yucatel. And then she said, "So what do you want to talk about?" And she was great in the doc. I think that
she came off well. Yes.
Yeah. That second part was so good. And it was because of Rachel, because you do get a feeling, the stalking of the National Enquirer and how they met her in Australia, and the big lie to Elin when that night when Tiger hit that fire hydrant. He was texting Rachel, "You're the only one I've ever loved." I don't know about you, other guys in this audience, but that's not something I would have on a text to another woman, you know. And that was the spark
Yeah.
that lit the scene that night. And you can point a lot of fingers at Rachel, but at that point in time, Tiger was living so many different lives. I mean, 4 or 5 different lives, not just as a golfer and as a businessman and as an iconic sports figure, but he was seeing 3 or 4 other women at the same time. And it was only a matter of time before something happened, before he drove off a cliff, so to speak. And Rachel was collateral damage. Tiger was on the cover of the New York Post for 21 straight days. That was
Wow.
more than 9/11. That gives you an idea of the craziness surrounding the scandal. But yeah, um, it was a really big get, so to speak, for us for the doc. And I know I've talked to Rachel since then. I know Jeff has. She's been, it hasn't been easy for her in her life most recently. So a lot of those women that went through that didn't come out well on the other side, and that's unfortunate.
Well, and also it turned completely upside down the images of Tiger Woods, which were well protected.
Yes, they
And
were.
we learned a lot of things about him. One of which, it was a little bit disturbing as a characteristic, not one that I admire. Where and everybody's had people in their life that they said, "Okay, that's it. I love you, but I can't deal with you anymore, and that's it. I'm never going to see you or talk to you again." When he turned his back on people, some of them were his most loyal people. Steve Williams, I guess that was a strange one. How did that relationship end
It
on
didn't
such a
end
sour
well.
note?
I
Yeah.
mean, you're absolutely right. That was one of the things that, just for your audience to understand how we did this, it took Jeff and I 3 years to do this book. The first year, all we did was read everything else that had been written about Tiger, all the books. And, God knows I went through so many articles. And Jeff and I, between the two of us, I looked at every single press conference he ever had on the PGA Tour. There's a place you can go, and they chronicle all this stuff, and they have it. So I went and looked at all that stuff. And one of the characteristics that we quickly discovered is when you had outlived your usefulness to Tiger Woods, and that was learned from Earl Woods, that was learned from his father, and so much like father, like son in Tiger's life. But when you no longer are useful to Tiger, whether it was John Merchant, who was a very prominent political figure in Connecticut and was really a second father to Tiger, and was really responsible for raising so much money in Connecticut to help fund Tiger's amateur career. Stevie Williams, Mark O'Meara, Hank Haney, Butch Harmon. There's a long list of people that devoted their lives in a lot of ways to Tiger, and when they had outlived their usefulness to Tiger, they were cut out like a part of his body, that had been there had been some sort of operation. And that's when you're trying to, when one thing that Jeff and I did with the Tiger book, we never tried to put our own feelings, prescribe our own attitudes to what Tiger was doing to try to judge him. Because, first of all, he's the most popular athlete on the face of the earth. I'm not even the most popular person in my house, most of the time. So what's it
I
like
know the
to
feeling.
be
Yeah.
Tiger Woods, to walk into a club in Vegas, where all the women want to be with you or dance with you or hang out with you? No idea. But what you do when you do the kind of reporting that we did, once we got into that second year, we realized that there were gaps in Tiger's life, and there were people in Tiger's life that were in those gaps that had never been interviewed before. And whether it was Alicia O'Meara, who was like a second mother to him, or Kel Devlin, who was a very prominent figure at Nike that was involved in their golf program, there was dozens of those people that we found and convinced them to talk to us. And that wasn't easy. But that certainly is a major part of Tiger's life, is when the bell rings and your time is up. It's not a pretty God, I love you. And like, Derek Jeter, who would, as the stories go, would give gift baskets to the women that, he had relationships with or slept with that night,
Yeah.
autographed baseball. And that wasn't Tiger. It was just like sayonara.
What kind of acknowledgement did you get from Tiger on this work?
Well, we didn't get anything from Tiger, but we had some conversations with his PR person at the time, and certainly Mark Steinberg. And Jeff and I went out of our way in the beginning to basically say, look, we're doing this book. And our first entree to them was, we're not requesting an interview. We're just requesting the opportunity to talk to you about the possibility of having an interview with Tiger. And what we got in return, and I think by that time I had done 10 books. Jeff had done maybe 12, all nonfiction, 22. Many of them had made the New York Times list. I was a fairly prominent television correspondent. Jeff is one of the best reporters and authors I've seen in my lifetime. What we got back was a lesson in journalism from Mark Steinberg and another gentleman. And it was just so dismissive and so unprofessional. What they said to us was, in order for us to talk to you, you're going to have to tell us everybody you talk to, both on and off the record, and what they said to you. And then you need to give us a list of questions. I was working at 60 Minutes at the time. We were interviewing presidents and heads of state.
Yeah.
We didn't give them questions. We gave them certain areas of interest, and I would have done that with Tiger. But in the end, I remember we were doing Outside the Lines and Bob Lee, with Bob Lee at the time, and Bob came in and there was something on the wire that the book had been out for like a day, and we literally they issued a press release that I could have written, which would have said, it's old news, there's nothing new here, this is all blah blah blah. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so. And I think, frankly, if you look at the sales of that book and the kind of reviews that it's had and where it stands in the pantheon of sports biographies, I think that the judge and the jury would lean more in our direction than they would in Tiger's direction.
To say his image was protected would be
Yeah.
the understatement of all time. I'll never forget Tom Rinaldi, who you know.
Oh yeah.
He used to be a frequent guest on our shows, although he might be big time in us that he went to Fox. We haven't talked to him for a while, or else he changed his number. Anyway, he's interviewing Tiger after a round that wasn't particularly good, and he's doing the usual things. He's outside of like Tiger's house there. They were playing somewhere in Orlando. And he's standing there, and in the background, as he's interviewing Tiger, you see this shadowy O.J. Simpson-like figure in all dark clothing, kind of flittering away from the house there. And I'm thinking, that's probably Dr. Galea right there, right? Is there going to be any allusion to, hey, who the hell is that guy, Tiger? And, they made no mention of that, and certainly no assertion that there was anything unkosher going on with the way he was being treated.
The steroid part of Tiger was always the third rail for us.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't get that right, you're going to get sued and you're going to lose. And so I spent a lot of time, Mark Lindsay, who was the doctor out of Toronto who was working with Tiger for his active release techniques on Tiger's body. Tony Gallia, who was the doctor that a lot of athletes were going to for this so-called cocktail of healing to accelerate their recovery from injuries. And that was, you talk about communications with Tiger. We went to his attorneys, one of his attorneys, and said, look, we're looking at this. And they knew we were looking at it. And Mark Lindsay gave us a statement, literally the testimony, legal testimony, that Tiger had never used performance enhancing drugs. He had never witnessed Tiger's use of performance enhancing drugs. And being in the business that Mark was in, he said, I would have known, I would have seen his body change. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's what we had in the book. And to get to that point, it took a lot of work and a lot of reporting, because you're leveraging certain kinds of information that we had against a comment from Tiger's side. And Tiger, to his credit, and he had to sign off on it. He allowed like it was sort of doctor patient privilege, for Mark to write that testimony, write that statement, and send it to us. So I felt like what we did, we went as far as humanly possible on that whole issue of performance enhancing drugs. And I will say to this day, when people ask me, what do you think? I'll say, I have no proof whatsoever that Tiger ever did it. And I would never say it unless I had 1000% proof. And we didn't have it. And so we gave the audience, our viewers, our readers, as close to what we could determine to be the truth as I think anybody's ever gotten.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see, the body breakdown, and you're naturally
Oh,
thinking,
yeah.
this is pretty unusual. I mean, a golfer maybe, has a wrist injury and it's persistent, or
You
Freddie
know,
Couples a bad back.
nobody worked out like Tiger did either. You know what I mean? And nobody practiced like he did. So for that, yes, you can look at that's kind of a red flag when your body begins to break down the way that Tiger's did. But then I look at what he did physically on a golf course and off the course. I mean, he was a beast in a training and in the weight room and running and all that stuff. So and I know probably I can't imagine anybody worked harder or longer than Tiger did, in practice. So, and he's been doing that since he was, he could walk basically. So how does that accumulate over the years? So you're weighing one thing against another, and like, man, that's about as high up on a wire as I ever want to get. When you're playing in that league, you better be damn sure what you're saying is right, and more importantly, it's defensible in court. And that has always been in my journalistic history is there's one standard. Can I defend this in court? And if I can't defend it in court, it's not going in a script, or it's not going in a book, or it's not coming out of my mouth.
Yeah, you didn't see Maguire or Sosa suing Canseco,
Right.
so that would be an indicator. Hey, I wanted to get into some 60 Minute stuff, and of course, you're on HBO Real Sports as well. Fantastic job doing, and they stuck you with the hard work. I mean, it's not. You mentioned Wertheim earlier. He'll be talking to some left-handed polo player, and off in Scotland somewhere, having a good time, drinking Guinness Stout or whatever. They sent you in for some hardcore stuff. And one of the things I always admired about your work on TV is you never back down. But were you ever tempted to make those Gumble faces after working with Brian Gumble all of those years, where somebody would say something that was obviously untrue and outrageous, and he would just make that face. But
Yeah. I never
you were
tried to
pretty
make,
stoic in those
yeah,
roles.
I never tried to make it about me. I was going to be very prepared. And that was, if you're a 60 Minutes correspondent, that's the best of the best. And I think is what you learn is I would go into those interviews, and I really felt like I knew as much about the person that I was interviewing as they did about themselves, and probably a little more in certain areas because of our ability to kind of just report things out. So I was always able to, wherever that interview was going to go, I was going to go with that subject in the direction that they were going. So I might want to talk about an arrest maybe halfway through the interview. But if that person brought up the arrest or her father's suicide or whatever it was, I wasn't going to look down in my notes and try to find, oh God, where is it? Oh, it's question number 31. I knew in my head, oh, well, that was the night after you graduated from high school. And so what we were trying to do, and this is why 60 Minutes is so good, you're stacking one moment after another, after another, after another. And that's when you do that for 11 and a half minutes or 12 minutes, those are the kinds of stories that people remember. And that's where I think a lot of the stories that I've done over the years are memorable because I wasn't, if you wanted to have, like, if you wanted to go nose to nose on something like I did with Vince McMahon about the deaths of wrestlers under the age of 45, I'm going to go there with you. I'm going to be respectful, but I'm not going to cower in front of you because I know what the questions are and I probably know what the answers are. And I always said, it's not the first question, it's not the second question, it's not the third question. Oftentimes it's the fourth question, a question that they've never been asked before because A, somebody doesn't know what the answer is, and B, the person across from you is afraid to ask it. And you just have to be of the mind that you're very respectful, but you're not backing down. And that's when things get interesting.
I think it tossed McMahon into a roid rage
Well,
when you were doing that
I thought,
interview.
man, I thought
Were you
Vince was,
tempted at some point to just yell out, McMahon?
yeah, there was a moment there when I thought he was going to literally leap out of his chair.
I mean, there's such great correspondence over the years. I'm a huge fan of Scott Pelley, who's on there now.
Yeah,
I think he does an excellent job and makes the stories extremely easy to understand and relatable, no matter
he's
how
a
complex they are.
great writer, great
Yeah,
television
and
writer.
perfect narration. Always had a great
Yeah.
demeanor when he was doing the evening news. I thought he was terrific. I never wanted to miss it. But I love him on 60 Minutes. Who were some of the guys that you worked with that you said, man,
I mean,
I just love that guy's style?
the ones that I would, Ed Bradley. I mean, Ed Bradley was everything that Ed did was like Jeff Fager, who was the EP of 60 Minutes for so long. And I actually just spoke to Jeff today. Um, Ed was like jazz. You know, you could go whatever way the conversation was going to go, Ed would go with you. And those kinds of things are really hard to do. Morley Safer, I mean, his pieces were so beautifully written, and his curiosity level was tremendous. I mean, Wallace was Wallace, one of a kind. You know, you knew what you were getting when you got Mike. You know, he was kind of that foot was to the accelerator from the time that he sat in the chair to the time he walked out of the chair. I think Sharon Alfonsi's a great 60 Minutes correspondent. Um, she's very relatable. She's a really good writer. She's good in the chair. Um, you know, there's Anderson is really good too. I mean, he's in his element there. He's not afraid to ask a tough question.
He'll do anything too. I mean,
He
he
will.
does all that daredevil shit, which is
Yeah, he
amazing.
does stuff like, I mean, Whitaker was just. I saw this piece where he's out in the frickin', I don't know, it was somewhere off the coast of like Alaska with these people that are they basically go out and save lives in the ocean, and it's the worst current. And Bill is like, he just laughed. He goes, "The things I do for this job." He goes, he was in the water for 15 minutes. They wanted me to go out one time, and we were chasing a trouble with treasure story. We went out into the Gulf of Mexico, and they're like, "Do you want to go down there? Will they dive for the emeralds?" I'm like, "No, I'm not. I can barely swim across my pool. You know, I don't
Understood.
even. I'm not going down there." So it
You're
was
in
like,
Blood Diamond.
yeah.
You've been very generous with your time. We love having you on, and we'd love to do it again anytime. But tell us about your latest effort. I know, I mean, yeah, so many books, and we didn't get to touch on all of them. But The System, of
I'm
course, you
really proud
mentioned
of.
Money Players. What's the
Yeah,
latest?
I'm proud of the price. It came out in August. It's selling really well. John Talty and I mean, we were deep inside big time college football. I was at the University of Michigan trying to understand what's happening with Harbaugh and the NCAA and why he eventually ended up with the Chargers in LA. Um, John was all over the SEC. There's great chapters in there on Nick Saban and Kirby Smart and Jimbo Fisher and Lane Kiffin I was out in Arizona with Jed Fish when he turned that program around, and now he's out in Washington trying to deal with, a bigger stage and brighter lights in the Big Ten. I was behind the scenes with the NCAA enforcement staff as they're grappling with this brave new world of NIL and the portal. It's some of the best work I've ever done, and it's really in the moment. I think what people that have read the book and reviewed the book, it's pretty remarkable that we got the access that we did, and B, we didn't just kill ourselves, writing it under the deadline that we had. Got it out on August 27th, and it's holding up. With even with all the lawsuits and the Claudia Wilkin case out in California. Um, you look into a crystal ball, and I think John and I were doing that all the time. Is what is college football going to look like in 3 or 4 years or 5 years? I don't think there's a clear picture, but I think the clearer picture is there's going to be a breakaway league. And whether it's, we know it'll be the Big Ten and the SEC and who else is along for the ride. But what we've learned is right now is things are so fractured. And when that's the case, when there's so much uncertainty, really two things: self-interest, greed, and money take precedent. And when you're looking at what's going on right now, it's pretty hard to argue against that. Everybody's kind of out for themselves because nobody knows what the future looks like. And everybody's like, okay, we got to batten down the hatches here. I got to make sure that we have a seat when the music stops. And, if you're outside that little ring of honor there of maybe 25 really Power 5, Power 4 teams, I know a lot of schools right now that have no freaking idea what the future looks like in their athletic department, and that's scary.
Coaches are diving off bridges in the middle of 5-year contracts. I mean,
yeah.
figuring they can't deal with this.
Well, that's why we called it the price, was because it's not
Yeah.
just the financial price, it's the physical price, it's the emotional price, and the psychological toll
Yeah.
that's being taken on everybody and anybody that's involved in college sports right now.
These are accomplished guys, too. Armin Katayan, fascinating. I hope we can do it again sometime down the road, and certainly other platforms. You've come a long way from Escondido, kid. Thanks so much for joining us.
So have you. You bet. Thank you.
All right, Armin Katayan, ladies and gentlemen, that's this week's edition of Conversations.